So welcome to this session, Revolutionary Ideas, Class and Class Consciousness. I'm Tom Griffiths, I'm your chair, NHS campaigner and campaigner on several things, of course, and Counterfire member. And we'll be hearing from Lindsey German today. So we've got an hour and 15 for this session. Lindsey's going to speak for about 25 minutes, and we'll have plenty of time for discussion and questions and so on. Please do keep those contributions to 2 minutes. I will be timing people and interrupting you because I think there's going to be a lot of space for a fantastic conversation, and we'd like to hear as many people as possible. So if you're all settled in, I'll pass over to Lindsey German. Lindsey German, for those that you don't know, of course, so he's a socialist, author and campaigner and a founding member of Counterfire, and she's going to talk to us on class and class consciousness. So Lindsey, 25 minutes, over to you.
Thanks very much, Tom. What I want to do today is to talk about class and class consciousness in looking at it from a sort of theoretical point of view, if you like. So as opposed to looking at all the different sort of sociologies and things about class. So that's what I'm intending to do. What I'm going to do is just put up a little PowerPoint here, which I'm not really going to talk to very much, but what I'm going to do is to use it to so you can see some of the quotes rather than me reading them out and not doing it as well as the original material. I thought it'd be good to have these sort of written down. So what I want to do when I talk about the whole history of class, and of course class is a word that you didn't really hear much before the Industrial Revolution. It wasn't a word that was much in use before the Industrial Revolution. But since the development of the Industrial Revolution and capitalism, it's been a central issue that is used all the time, and nowhere more so than in the writings of Marx and his associates and continuing with socialists today. And we talk about class society, we talk about class, we talk about these things all the time. But what I want to talk about today is really to try and locate this this idea of class in the Marxist tradition, and particularly following on from the talk on historical materialism yesterday, and to look at what it actually means. And what I'm going to do is, first of all, look at this quote that is from Marx and Engels in the Communist Manifesto. The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. In other words, if you're looking at the motor of history, then you're looking at class struggles, and you're looking as well at the economic developments in society that Marx believed very, very strongly that ideas didn't drive society, but that society and its development drove ideas and drove the different ways people had of looking at things. So when they talked in the Communist Manifesto, which they wrote in 1847, published at the beginning of 1848, a year of revolutions, they wrote about all this history of hitherto existing society was this history of class struggles. And they use these different examples, freeman and slave, patrician and plebeian, which was, of course, the Roman distinction of class, lord and serf, which was the Middle Ages distinction, guildmaster and journeyman, the people who worked in the guilds. In a word, oppressor and oppressed stood in constant opposition to one another, carrying on an uninterrupted, now hidden, now open fight that each time ended either in the revolutionary constitution of society at large or in the common ruin of the contending classes. And this is important because class struggle, and I'll come on to describe this a little bit more, class struggle is a kind of objective thing, it happens, but then it doesn't, the subjective element within it, the way in which people struggle, the ideas in their heads, this is something which doesn't particularly happen in a particular way. And therefore there's no automatic road towards revolution. It's something that depends very, very much, not just on the objective conditions that people find themselves in, but also in the subjective factor of, particularly from our point of view, of organizations of revolutionaries. So when you talk about the development of capitalism, we're talking about capitalism developing as a revolutionary system. And again, Marx and Engels are very, very clear on this in the Communist Manifesto and elsewhere, where they talk about that capitalism itself is a revolutionary system which overthrows and destroys all that's gone before it. And they talk about these great revolutionary movements that took place in the Netherlands with the Dutch Republic in the 17th century, in England, where they cut off the king's head in 1649, here in this country, established a republic, a commonwealth, in France, where in 1789 they stormed the Bastille and had this major revolutionary movement which overthrew the old feudal order. And those revolutions were incredibly important in establishing societies where capitalism could grow and where it could develop, and where the economics based on capitalism could develop. I illustrated this one by a very famous painting by Eugène Delacroix, which is Liberty Leading the People, actually a picture of the 1830 revolution, because France had a number of revolutions. It had its original one, then there was counter-revolution, then they had the 1831, then they had the 1848. So there's a long, long tradition in France of these revolutions. And this picture sums up this actual process of the bourgeois revolution, the woman with the flag leading actually different classes represented here in the picture, but led by representatives of the bourgeoisie. And their demands were demands for individual liberty, demands for economic freedom, demands for democracy, and for republicanism. And these were all demands which fitted very, very much with what the capitalist class needed in order to open up society for capitalist development and capitalist rule. So you had all this going on. However, as capitalism developed, as you had the 1830 revolution, and as you went on to have the 1848 revolutions, which were right across Europe, you had a situation where capitalism created these new revolutionary situations, created industrial society, created modern, what we would call sort of bourgeois democratic states, if you want to call it that. They also created something else, which was the development of the working class, because capitalism itself creates the working class. Very famously, Marx refers to the working class as the gravedigger of capitalism. It's a class which is created by capital. It's created by capital because you have this process in capitalist production where you have the production of surplus value, what's called surplus value. You have the production of wealth which is carried out by working class people, and therefore you have this system where the capitalist owns the wealth, the worker sells their labor power in order to work in the factory or in the mill or maybe in the office today or wherever we're talking about. They sell their labor power in order to produce, they need to sell their labor power in order to live, but they also do so in order to produce wealth for the capitalist class. So you get this situation where you have these revolutions which usher in capitalism from the old feudal order. At the same time, they create a situation where the working class becomes a threat. Immediately, the creation of the working class, suddenly the capitalists are not just looking at their enemies, their old enemies in the feudal order, the Catholic Church, the old landowners, the aristocracy. They're not just looking at them, they're saying, God, there's this new class that is being created. It's being created in the factories and in the mills, and it is a class which actually is in antagonism to the capitalist class. So you have this development of capitalist society, and of course, once this happens, the bourgeoisie, the capitalist class, begins to fear the working class more than it fears the old order. And Engels put this very, very succinctly when he was describing the 1848 revolutions in Germany and elsewhere. And he says to the capitalist class, he says, the executioner stands at the door. In other words, he says, enjoy, your revolution, enjoy your wealth, enjoy the new democratic forms you've got, because it isn't going to last long, because the working class, what they called the proletariat, is going to come and is going to take your wealth away from you and is going to take collective control of society. So Engels described this as the executioner, which is the working class standing at the door, waiting to take over from the capitalist class. George Lukács, who wrote very, very importantly on this question of class and class consciousness, which I'll come on to in a little while. Lukács, who was a Hungarian Marxist writing in the 20th century, he puts it kind of more sophisticatedly, I suppose you could say. He says the tragedy of the bourgeoisie is reflected historically in the fact that even before it had defeated its predecessor, feudalism, in other words, the old medieval system, he says even before it had defeated its predecessor, its new enemy, the proletariat, had appeared on the scene. And Lukács draws from that very, very important conclusions. He says that because the proletariat has appeared on the scene, it means that in some situations, as in Germany itself, the capitalist class made its peace with the old order in most cases, rather than see the working class emerge as a very strong player on the scene. So that was one thing that happened. But another thing that happened was that all the demands, all the revolutionary demands of the bourgeoisie and the bourgeois revolutions began to turn into their opposites. So, for example, they hid or tried to hide as much as they could of the violent origins of their own society. So, and you find this today in England. I mean, the amount that you hear about the English Revolution, the execution of Charles I, all of these different things is very, very limited. It's not something, the British ruling class does not praise the English Revolution at all. There is a statue of Cromwell outside Parliament, but that's about it. There was never, George V would not allow a battleship to be named after Oliver Cromwell, and this was right in the 20th century. Such was their antagonism to him. So the bourgeoisie tries to eradicate its own radical past, and it tries to eradicate the appearance of class conflict from society. And it does this in a number of ways. It also goes from being very democratic in a full sense to being less and less democratic. The more that the working class have political power, the less they have any real purchase on genuine democracy. It goes from the idea of liberty and freedom to much, much greater repression by the state, by the police, by the army, and by all those sorts of things. So it tries to eradicate all these different sorts of things. And it's this that is the beginning of what I want to talk about in terms of what class and class consciousness really means. So you have this working class. Now, what is important about this working class is that it's a growing class. It's a class which has immense power precisely because it produces the wealth in society. And it's a working class which exists, whether it knows it exists or it knows in its own head, in each individual worker's head, whether it exists or not. And that's an important point, that if you are a worker, this is something which is an objective fact, and it's not designated by how you dress, how you speak, what kind of job you necessarily do, what your cultural interests are. These may or may not indicate certain factors about working class people at any one time, but the crucial definition of whether or not you are working class is whether you sell your labor power in order to live, which is the condition of the vast majority of us, that we couldn't survive without having to go to work and to sell our labor power for a wage, and whether that you are exploited in that process. And the process of exploitation goes like this, very, very simply, that you go to work for 8 hours a day. Let's say you're paid £20 an hour. If you're lucky, you're paid £20 an hour. The amount of wealth you produce will probably amount to £40 an hour. The difference between what you are paid in your wage and what what you produce is essentially the profit of the employer. And that's a very simple view of it, and there's all sorts of other bits that you have to take into account. But essentially, you are having the product of your labor taken from you. And that's the first most important point when people talk about class from a Marxist point of view. The second point, and this is what's important about class consciousness, is that most workers are not aware of they're not conscious of themselves or of their role as a revolutionary class. In fact, far from it. And we know from our own empirical experience about ourselves, about our families, about our friends, about our workmates. We know, firstly, that most people don't have an understanding of that process of exploitation. Secondly, we know that working people have all sorts of ideas which are very far from being revolutionary ideas. They may be racist, they may be sexist, they may accept that the boss has the right to make more money because he's been an entrepreneur and he's invested the money at the right time, and all these kind of ideas that people have. So we know there's a massive amount of uneven consciousness inside the working class. And that this, the explanation for this, which is very often put, and it's very often put, if you look, lots of the explanations sort of in the Labour Party or around the Labour Party and around the trade unions, the argument which will be put, why do people not have class consciousness, not understand that their role is in conflict with the role of their employer and their manager? Well, it's very often put that people have got this consciousness because they haven't had enough education about working class history or whatever. Or it might be that people say, well, it's because the media tell them lies, or it might be because they've got a mortgage and therefore they don't care about, wider revolutionary change or wider social change in society. And, all of these things, there's obviously an element of truth in them. That, the media does lie to working people. It does tell us that there's a natural order of things with the Queen at the very top and the poorest of us at the very bottom. We don't know our own history. We don't know our own development as a class. So this is something which is hidden. We're certainly not taught it in schools or in universities for the most part. So there's a great deal of truth in this, but of course, it can't explain why the working class as a whole doesn't develop a revolutionary consciousness, doesn't develop a consciousness of itself as a class. So I think you've got to look elsewhere to looking at why the working class doesn't develop that consciousness in the way that we would hope that it would. And there you have to start with this process of exploitation as well, because when Marx talks about this, he talks about the alienation of the worker from the products that they produce. And you've got this situation where you have you have a situation. I saw a picture of a woman in Bangladesh who was holding up a poster saying, "I earn 60 cents for each dress that I produce." Now, the obvious response to this is that this woman will not only is she underpaid for dresses that are probably sold for $100 when they go to the United States, but there's no way that she can even begin to afford the products that she herself produces. And this is true for most of the products that workers themselves produce. So they're alienated from the products of their labor, which hasn't been the case for most of human history, but is central to the whole system of exploitation under capitalism. And not only that, they're alienated from their own ability to labor. They don't understand their labor power, which is the thing that they sell. They don't understand this as a commodity. They just see it as something, I have to go to work. I don't like Mondays. I wish the weekend was here. All the sort of things that people sum it up like that. They don't see their labor power as the commodity that it is. And therefore, they don't have any understanding. They don't have any clear view of what their role in society is. And Lukas, who I quoted there, his his view of the bourgeoisie, but he also says that the worker can only become conscious of his existence when he becomes aware of himself as a commodity. So it's only when you begin to see that you are actually yourself part of the commodity production of capitalist society that you begin to look at society as a whole, and you begin to look at the way that you can change society. And Lukács makes the point that this alienation is something which it literally in the German, it means the word in German is Entfremdung, which means estrangement. It means that you're a stranger to yourself. You're a stranger to everything that should be natural and familiar to you, but it isn't, because what you produce, what you work at is taken from you, and therefore the work that you do isn't something that you value. It isn't something that you're properly rewarded for. It isn't any of those things. It's something which is completely alien to you. And that was a very important point for him. And you can, for working class people, you can only overcome this alienation through collective class struggle. And this is a central point when we're looking at how you do it. It's only in the process of fighting against the process of exploitation, of fighting against the alienation, of fighting against those sorts of things, you can begin to see the reality of society as it actually is, not as it is projected by capitalist society. It's only then you begin to see the truth of what is happening to you as an individual and to your class as the working class. So that question of class struggle is absolutely central to beginning to see how society as a whole works, to beginning to see how the whole system operates. That can only be achieved, class struggle can only be achieved as part of a collective. It is impossible. It's not impossible for individual capitalists or individual slave owners or individual slaves come to individual consciousness, but you can only begin to change your consciousness as a result of class struggle, and that class struggle is by definition a collective struggle. It's you and your workmates, or maybe your fellow tenants, or maybe the people that you go on a demonstration with. It's you versus, whether it's your factory owner, whether it's the government, whether it's the council that is denying you the housing, whatever it is. It's only in the process of that struggle that you begin to see society as it is. And that has to be a collective struggle. And this in turn shows not just the objective power of working people, but also their subjective power, that they then begin to see, yes, we do have a power. We do have a power which can challenge capital. We do have a power which can begin to overturn the existing exploitative relationships, which can begin to run society in a particularly different way. And indeed, for Lukács in particular, he talks about if you engage in this collective class struggle, that eventually the aim of working class struggle and class consciousness is actually to abolish not just capitalist rule, but to abolish class society as a whole. That's the long-term goal that you want to aim at. So those are the different aspects of class consciousness, but there's one more that I want to talk about before I conclude, and that is I started at the beginning with the bourgeois revolutions and how the bourgeoisie and their allies, which were the emerging working class, the sort of some of the sort of professional classes like the lawyers and students and some of the peasants, all sorts of different societies, the bourgeoisie and their allies made these revolutions. But they made them in very different conditions from the ones that we talk about with working class revolution. And there's one overwhelming reason for this, and that is that the emerging capitalist class develops within the existence of the old feudal society. You know, the bourgeoisie, the capitalists, they establish, if you've ever been to some of the old Italian city-states, you will see, they established a banking system. They established trade, they established merchant, beautiful, incredible buildings and art and all this sort of thing. They established this long, long before the end of feudalism. If you look in this country, the establishment of universities like Oxford and Cambridge, the establishment of the Protestant religion, of libraries, of some of these different, some inventions, lots of these things were done within the existing feudal society, and the capitalist class amassed huge amounts of wealth as a result of doing this, huge amounts of prestige and huge amounts of power, and that led to the growth of them and the clash with the old order, which you saw in the 17th century in England, in the 18th century in France, and so on. They were able to do so. Now, the working class doesn't have that. The working class doesn't have property. But I mean, you know, I'm not talking about whether people have a mortgage for 25, 30 years on a flat or a semi-detached house. I'm talking that we don't have property in any significant sense in capitalist society. Doesn't have property, doesn't have its own universities, doesn't have wealth that it amasses. Its power is its own power to labour and to organise collectively as part of that. So how does the working class...
2 minutes, Lindsey.
Thanks, yeah. How does the working class organise in these circumstances? It organises through the process of a revolutionary party. And the party is, because the working class consciousness is uneven, and Alex will be talking about this more in the final session in this series, because the working class consciousness is uneven, people need to gather together the most radical, the most informed, the most conscious workers into a revolutionary organization. And that's the important thing. The Revolutionary Party is a party which a man called Jakubowski, who I hope they'll put a link for his book, which is absolutely marvelous on all of this, in my opinion. He says the party is simultaneously the product and the producer of class consciousness. And this tells you, it's the product of class consciousness. We learn from our history, we learn from our failures and our victories in the working class struggle. We learn from the class struggle all the time. And this is a constant process for working class people. And revolutionary theory is really part of, revolutionary theory is really condensed history. It's our condensed history. This is what we're talking about. But it's also the producer of class consciousness. In other words, the Revolutionary Party also tries to be the memory of the working class, that to say this is what's happened in the past, how can we do it this time, what can succeed, what can fail. So this, the question of how we develop working class consciousness successfully depends very much also on the development of a revolutionary party. And just that picture is by an artist, it's called the Bolshevik, and it's got the red flag, unlike the tricolour of the previous, the 1830 revolution. So I'll leave it there. Thanks very much, Tom. I hope I didn't go on too long, and I hope that we can have a discussion on all of that.